"You've been sitting at the end of this table for 30 years, Harrison," Isabel said with a graceful smile as she lifted a crystal wine bottle into the candlelight. "And somehow you still don't understand what family means." No one answered her. They never did. That silence had become another tradition inside Blackwood House, a sprawling old money estate where polished oak floors reflected generations of carefully protected appearances, and every portrait hanging on the walls seemed to watch us guard secrets that were older than I was. My name is Harrison Cole. I'm 70 years old, and for 3 decades I allowed everyone in that dining room to believe I was the least important person at the table. It was easier that way. People reveal far more when they think you don't matter. The dining room stretched nearly 50 feet from the marble fireplace to the tall windows overlooking the winter gardens. Eleanor sat beneath the antique chandelier, gently folding her linen napkin again and again without taking a single bite of dinner. David stared into his untouched glass, exhausted from carrying responsibilities he never fully understood. Ethan leaned casually against the staircase railing just outside the dining room, pretending to scroll through his phone while quietly studying every expression in the room. James, our loyal butler, moved with practiced precision, refilling glasses before anyone asked, though I noticed his hands trembled ever so slightly whenever he passed behind Victoria's chair. Victoria remained perfectly composed at the head of the table, her posture flawless, her silver jewelry catching the warm light like tiny pieces of armor. She had always believed control looked like elegance. Across from her, Isabel wore confidence as naturally as she wore silk. She complimented the chef, discussed charity events, laughed at the right moments, and somehow directed every conversation without raising her voice. Most people would have called her charming. I had learned years ago that charm could become the finest disguise ever invented. Thomas, the family attorney, arrived 10 minutes late carrying nothing more than a slim leather portfolio. Sophia followed quietly behind him, offering polite greetings before taking a seat near the doorway. Neither of them reached for the wine James offered. They exchanged a brief glance instead, one so subtle almost no one noticed it. Almost no one except Ethan. He looked toward me for only a second. It was enough. He had begun asking questions weeks ago. Questions nobody else wanted answered. Questions that eventually led to one sealed envelope resting inside Thomas's portfolio. The conversation continued as though nothing unusual had entered the room, but beneath the polished manners and expensive smiles, every heartbeat seemed to wait for something unseen. I folded my hands, looked down the length of that magnificent oak table, and realized the greatest lie our family had ever protected was finally running out of places to hide. Nobody reached for dessert. That alone told me everything. In families like ours, uncomfortable conversations were usually buried beneath polished manners and expensive traditions, but that evening every untouched plate seemed to carry its own confession. James quietly cleared the first course while the silverware made soft, measured sounds against the china. He had worked for this family for more than 40 years. He knew every birthday, every anniversary, every celebration, and every argument that had ever echoed through those halls. Yet even he avoided looking directly at Thomas's leather portfolio resting beside his chair. I noticed Sophia watching James with quiet curiosity. She was young compared to the rest of us, but she possessed the patience that only good attorneys learned early in their careers. She listened far more than she spoke. Ethan finally slipped into the empty chair beside me instead of remaining near the staircase. It was a small decision, but inside this house, even small decisions carried weight. He leaned toward me just enough that only I could hear him. "Grandpa, they know something is coming, do they not?" I answered without turning my head. "Some of them do. The others only feel it." He nodded slowly. He had inherited something rare in this family. He observed before he judged. Across the table, Isabel continued, discussing renovations to the East Wing as though she were hosting an ordinary dinner party. She complimented the architect, praised the craftsmanship of imported marble, and spoke confidently about preserving the family's legacy. David tried to contribute, but every sentence sounded uncertain, as though he had spent years repeating ideas that belonged to someone else. Victoria corrected him twice with gentle smiles that felt more like instructions than affection. Eleanor remained almost perfectly still beneath the chandelier. Every few minutes she glanced toward an old oil painting hanging above the fireplace. It portrayed the original Blackwood family gathered around a dining table remarkably similar to the one we occupied now. I had stared at that painting thousands of times over the years. Tonight, for the first time, I realized every face in it looked trapped rather than proud. Thomas finally placed one hand on the portfolio, but did not open it. "Before we discuss business," he said calmly, "there is one matter that deserves complete honesty." Isabel laughed softly. Honesty has never been in short supply here. James stopped walking for only a heartbeat before continuing toward the kitchen. Sophia quietly folded her hands together. Ethan looked at me once again. I simply reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. The truth rarely arrived with raised voices. More often it entered the room as silence, waiting patiently until nobody had anywhere left to hide. Thomas rested his fingertips on the worn leather portfolio as though he were measuring the exact weight of the moment before speaking again. No one interrupted him. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, its steady rhythm echoing through the vast house. "Before we move forward," he said evenly, "I would like to ask a simple question. Has anyone at this table ever wondered why certain family records were sealed for more than 30 years? Isabel smiled with practiced confidence. "Old families protect old documents. That is hardly unusual." Thomas acknowledged her answer with a slight nod, but offered nothing in return. He slowly opened the portfolio and removed a thick cream-colored envelope that had never been mailed. It carried no address, only a wax seal bearing the original Blackwood crest. I recognized it immediately. I had seen that seal once before many years earlier, and I had spent decades pretending I had forgotten it. David frowned as he leaned forward. "I have never seen that before." Victoria answered before Thomas could speak. "There are many documents you have never needed to see." Her tone remained calm, but for the first time that evening her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Across the table, Eleanor quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though an old memory had finally caught up with her. Ethan watched every movement without saying a word. His attention shifted from the envelope to my face. He had begun noticing something that everyone else had overlooked. I was not surprised. I was waiting. Sophia carefully slid a second envelope onto the polished oak table beside the first. Unlike the older document, this one was modern, neatly labeled, and sealed by a certified laboratory. David looked between the two envelopes with growing confusion. "What is this?" he asked. Thomas answered with remarkable calm. "One document explains how this family built its public story. The other tests whether that story was ever true." The room became impossibly still. James had returned carrying fresh coffee, but he stopped just inside the doorway when he saw the envelopes resting in front of Thomas. He lowered the silver tray onto a sideboard without making a sound. Isabel gave a soft laugh that felt almost rehearsed. "Surely we are not about to let paperwork ruin a perfectly pleasant evening." Nobody joined her laughter. Ethan slowly folded his hands together and looked directly at Thomas. "Open them," he said quietly. I glanced around the table one last time. Every polished surface, every priceless painting, every carefully preserved tradition had survived generation after generation. But I had learned something about lies. They could live comfortably inside magnificent houses for decades, yet the smallest piece of verified truth could make every beautiful wall feel suddenly fragile. Thomas broke the wax seal with deliberate care, unfolding the aged document as though every crease carried another forgotten decade. The paper had yellowed with time, yet the handwriting remained remarkably clear. Nobody spoke while his eyes moved across the first page. The silence felt heavier than any accusation. Finally, he looked up. "This document was prepared 32 years ago at the request of the late Charles Blackwood," he said calmly. David frowned. "My grandfather?" Thomas nodded once. He instructed that these records remain sealed until very specific conditions were met. Isabel leaned back in her chair with a polite smile that no longer reached her eyes. "Surely whatever grandfather wanted has little relevance today." Thomas did not answer her immediately. Instead, he carefully placed the old document beside the unopened laboratory envelope. "On the contrary," he replied, "everything that has happened since then depends upon what was written here." Victoria spoke before anyone else could respond. "Charles often created complicated legal arrangements. That was simply his way." Her voice remained steady, yet she no longer looked directly at Thomas. She stared toward the fireplace instead, as though searching for reassurance inside memories that no longer felt dependable. Eleanor slowly lowered her gaze. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, but I noticed the slight tremble in her fingers. I had seen that same expression only once before, many years earlier, on the afternoon we buried Charles. James returned to the room carrying fresh coffee, setting each cup down with practiced precision. When he reached my chair, he hesitated for the briefest moment. Our eyes met. Neither of us needed words. We both understood that some promises became heavier the longer they were carried. Ethan finally broke the silence. If this document changes everything, why was it hidden for so long? Thomas answered without hesitation. Because sometimes people mistake preserving peace for preserving truth. Sophia quietly opened her notebook but wrote nothing. She simply listened, allowing every sentence to settle across the room. David rubbed his forehead, looking from Thomas to Victoria and then toward Isabel. Someone needs to explain what is happening. Isabel offered a reassuring smile toward him. There is nothing to worry about. Families survive rumors all the time. I watched her carefully. She had chosen one particular word. Rumors. Thomas had presented no rumor, only records. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. He rested one hand on the second envelope from the laboratory and looked around the table one final time. The historical record tells us how this story began, he said quietly. The laboratory findings tell us whether everyone has been living inside that story honestly. For the first time all evening, nobody attempted to interrupt him. Even the magnificent old house seemed to surrender to the waiting silence, as though every stone and every beam had grown tired of protecting the same secret for another generation. Thomas rested his hand on the laboratory envelope for several long seconds before carefully breaking the seal. The crisp paper inside contrasted sharply with the aged document beside it, as though the past and the present had finally agreed to meet at the same table. He removed several pages and adjusted his glasses. Nobody moved. Even Isabel stopped pretending to smile. David shifted uneasily in his chair, his eyes moving from Thomas to Victoria and then toward Eleanor, searching for reassurance that never came. Thomas cleared his throat. Several months ago, I received instructions to safeguard these findings until every required legal condition had been satisfied. David looked genuinely confused. Who requested that? Thomas answered without hesitation. Harrison did. Every face turned toward me. I remained exactly where I had been sitting all evening, my hands folded quietly in front of me. I had spent years allowing others to believe I simply accepted whatever happened around me. They never imagined that patience could be mistaken for surrender. Isabel studied me carefully. You ordered genetic testing without telling anyone. Her voice remained controlled, but the confidence inside it had begun to fade. I asked questions, I replied calmly. The answers followed. Ethan looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration. You already knew something was wrong. I gave him a faint smile. I knew too many pieces of the story refused to fit together. Thomas continued reading. The laboratory completed independent testing using legally documented samples provided through proper authorization. Sophia quietly placed another folder beside him. Every step has been verified and fully documented, she added. The chain of custody has been reviewed multiple times. Victoria finally leaned forward. Surely this has gone far enough. Families are not held together by laboratory reports. Her voice remained composed, but there was an unfamiliar tension beneath every carefully chosen word. Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes toward me. They were filled with regret rather than fear. I understood that expression because I had carried it myself for many years. James entered once more, placing a fresh pot of coffee near the center of the table before quietly stepping back. His gaze lingered on the laboratory pages only briefly before returning to the floor. He had protected this household with unwavering loyalty, but even loyalty had limits when truth finally arrived. Thomas lowered the first page and looked around the room. The results do not accuse anyone, he said quietly. They simply establish facts that cannot be altered by memory, influence, or family tradition. Nobody attempted to interrupt him this time. Outside, the evening wind brushed softly against the tall windows of Blackwood House, while inside the magnificent dining room, every carefully guarded certainty seemed to loosen its grip, waiting for the single sentence that would finally separate inheritance from identity and appearance from undeniable truth. Thomas lowered the laboratory report onto the table with extraordinary care, as though placing it down too quickly might somehow change what had already been verified. He removed his glasses, looked around the dining room, and allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "The findings are conclusive," he said in a calm voice. "There is no indication of error, substitution, or uncertainty." David looked from Thomas to Sophia, searching both faces for hesitation. He found none. "Then tell us," he said quietly. "What exactly do these findings prove?" Thomas folded his hands. "They prove that a fundamental assumption this family has relied upon for decades is not supported by the documented evidence." Nobody breathed for what felt like several seconds. Isabel was the first to recover. That statement could mean almost anything. She replied with measured confidence. "Perhaps," Thomas answered, "but the supporting records remove any room for interpretation." Sophia slid another certified document across the polished oak table. "Every record has been reviewed independently," she explained. "The historical documents, the laboratory analysis, and the legal files all point toward the same conclusion." Victoria's composed expression finally began to soften into uncertainty. "Charles believed families survived because some questions remained unanswered," she said quietly. I looked at her for a long moment before speaking for the first time since Thomas had opened the report. "No," I replied. "Charles believed families survived because the truth eventually found the right moment." Eleanor slowly lifted both hands from her lap and placed them on the edge of the table. Tears did not fill her eyes, but years of quiet regret did. "I wanted to tell everyone," she whispered. More than once. The room turned toward her. Even Isabel looked genuinely surprised. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly before continuing. "Every time I gathered the courage, someone convinced me that protecting the family name mattered more than correcting the story. After enough years, silence began to feel easier than honesty." James lowered his head respectfully. He had heard fragments over the years, but had never crossed the line that loyalty demanded he respect. Ethan looked at his grandmother with compassion rather than judgment. "You carried that by yourself all this time?" he asked gently. Eleanor nodded once. "Every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration. I reminded myself that tomorrow would be the better day to speak." Tomorrow became 30 years. Nobody challenged her. Nobody accused her. The weight of postponed truth had become visible to everyone sitting around that enormous table. Thomas gathered the documents into neat stacks once more before resting one hand upon the final page. "There is one remaining record," he said quietly. "It explains why these documents were never meant to be opened separately. Only when read together do they reveal who understood the truth from the very beginning and who carefully ensured that everyone else never would." Thomas reached beneath the final page and carefully unfolded a handwritten letter that had been preserved inside a protective sleeve for decades. The paper was thinner than the legal documents, its edges softened by time, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. "Charles Blackwood." No one spoke while Thomas silently handed the letter to me. I looked at the familiar handwriting for a long moment before placing it back on the table. "Read it," I said. Thomas nodded and began. "If you are hearing these words, then the day I feared has finally arrived. Wealth can build magnificent homes, but it cannot protect a family from dishonesty. I have left these records sealed because truth revealed too early can be ignored. Truth revealed at the proper time cannot." David lowered his head as every sentence seemed to answer questions he had never known to ask. Thomas continued reading. "The one person I trusted to protect these documents was Harrison. He understands patience better than anyone I have ever known. Others may seek influence. Others may seek appearance. Harrison seeks only what can be proven." Isabel looked directly at me for the first time all evening. "You have known about this letter all these years." I answered honestly. I knew it existed. I did not know every word inside it. Charles believed that even I should not read it until tonight. Ethan leaned forward, unable to hide his curiosity. "Grandpa, why you?" I smiled faintly. "Because I never wanted control. People who do not chase power are often the safest people to trust with it." James quietly nodded from across the room. He had watched that truth play out over decades. Victoria remained silent, her confidence gradually replaced by reflection. She understood something now that perhaps she had resisted for years. Authority could be inherited, but credibility had to be earned. Sophia reached for another folder she had brought with her. "There is one final collection of records," she explained. "Electronic correspondence, archived legal instructions, and certified timelines. Together they establish who had access to these sealed matters over the past 3 decades." Isabel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was the first genuine uncertainty anyone had seen from her that evening. David noticed it as well. He slowly turned toward her. "Is there something you have not told me?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the tall windows where the last light of evening had disappeared behind the gardens. The silence that followed no longer felt protective. It felt revealing. Thomas closed the letter with careful respect before resting his hand on the final folder. "History explained how the secret survived," he said quietly. "These records explain who made certain it continued surviving long after it should have ended." Thomas opened the final folder with the same deliberate patience he had shown throughout the evening. Unlike the older papers, these pages carried printed timestamps, archived correspondence, and notarized certifications arranged in perfect chronological order. He spread them across the center of the table without saying a word. For the first time, every person seated in Blackwood House looked at the same evidence instead of looking at one another. Sophia quietly pointed toward the earliest record. "These communications span more than 20 years. They have been preserved through independent archives and verified for authenticity." David reached for the first page with hesitant hands. His eyes moved from one date to another, then to a series of initials that appeared repeatedly beside internal family instructions. "These approvals could not have happened without someone deliberately authorizing them," he said slowly. Thomas nodded. "Correct. The records establish a continuous pattern rather than a single decision." Isabel leaned forward to study the documents herself. Her composed expression remained remarkably calm, yet she no longer attempted to direct the conversation. Instead, she examined each page carefully, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Victoria looked toward Eleanor, who answered only with quiet sadness. There was no anger between them anymore. Only the unmistakable weight of years spent protecting a version of the family that no longer matched reality. Ethan noticed something none of the others had mentioned. Every important document passed through the same review process, he observed. Someone kept renewing the restrictions instead of allowing the files to become public. Thomas acknowledged him with genuine respect. Exactly. The secrecy did not survive by accident. It survived because someone continued choosing silence whenever honesty became possible. James stepped forward carrying a small wooden box that had rested for decades inside the library safe. He placed it gently beside Thomas. "Mr. Harrison instructed me years ago that this box should only be opened if all the legal records reached the same conclusion," he said quietly. I looked at the familiar box for a long moment before sliding the small brass key across the table toward Ethan. His eyes widened. "Me?" he asked. I nodded. "The future deserves to open what the past could not." Ethan carefully unlocked the lid. Inside rested several old family photographs, handwritten notes, and a single sealed envelope bearing Charles Blackwood's personal signature once again. Nobody reached toward it. Nobody hurried the moment. The house that had spent generations protecting appearances now stood perfectly still, while a younger pair of hands prepared to uncover the final piece of a story that had shaped every life gathered around that long oak table. Ethan held the sealed envelope with both hands as though he understood that some moments deserved more respect than excitement. The room remained completely silent while he carefully opened it and unfolded the final letter inside. The handwriting matched every other note Charles Blackwood had left behind. Ethan looked toward Thomas, who nodded gently, giving him permission to read. "If this letter has been opened," Ethan began, "then my family has finally chosen truth over comfort. That choice alone is worth more than any inheritance I could leave behind." He paused before continuing. "Do not measure your family by appearances, titles, or assumptions repeated often enough to sound like facts. Measure your family by honesty, character, and the courage to correct a mistake, even after many years." Every word seemed to remove another layer of weight from the old house. Nobody interrupted. Nobody objected. Charles had anticipated this very evening decades before it happened. Ethan reached the final paragraph. "Harrison was never chosen because he knew every answer. He was chosen because he refused to change the truth for his own benefit. If this family ever loses its way, trust the person who seeks evidence instead of influence. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw complete understanding instead of curiosity. David quietly stood from his chair and walked to the long windows overlooking the gardens. He remained there for several moments before turning back toward the table. "I spent my entire life believing I had inherited certainty," he said softly. "Tonight, I realized I inherited questions instead. I should have asked them much sooner." Eleanor reached for his hand, and he accepted it without hesitation. Victoria closed her eyes briefly before offering a small nod to no one in particular. Even Isabel no longer searched for another explanation. The documents, the records, the laboratory findings, and Charles's own words had formed one complete story that could no longer be divided into convenient pieces. Thomas carefully gathered every paper and returned them to their folders. "The legal record will be updated to reflect the verified facts," he said. "From this day forward, the family archives will preserve the truth rather than the assumption." James quietly opened the dining room doors, allowing the cool evening air to drift into the house for the first time that night. I rose from my chair and looked once around the magnificent room that had witnessed generations of celebrations, misunderstandings, and carefully guarded silence. It looked exactly the same as it had at the beginning of dinner, yet everything inside it had changed. Ethan walked beside me as we made our way toward the front hall. Neither of us hurried. There was nothing left to chase. Some people believe the truth destroys families. I have learned something different. The truth does not destroy a family. It simply removes the lie that has been standing where trust was always meant to be.